Welcome everybody to today's session of the 50 plus Shades of Gothic conference series. And today's panel is ECOGOTHIC, Wilderness, the Environment, and the Gothic. So our first presentation is titled The Organism as Environment, Exploring the Material Within the Aesthetics of the ECOGOTHIC in Stranger Things and Annihilation. And this presentation is by Sladja Blazan, who is a lecturer of American Studies at the University of Würzburg. She received her PhD from Humboldt University, Berlin in 2005. Recently, she completed a manuscript that explores the intersection of the spectrality and morality under the title Ghosts and Their Hosts, Spectrality in Early US American Literature and Culture, which is currently under review. Also, an edited collection with the title Haunted Nature, Entanglements Between the Human and the Non-Human will be published in the fall with Palgrave Macmillan. And her areas of research include speculative fiction, critical posthumanism, critical refuge studies, and migration as a literary topic. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this really kind introduction. Okay, so since this is really not, it's a very short time, I don't really have a proper presentation, but I wanted to workshop a little bit with you and just talk about a chapter that I wrote for the edited collection on haunted nature that is going to be published with Palgrave hopefully in the fall. So it's in the very, very finishing stages right now, and then it's going in print very soon. But I still can add some very final changes tonight because I'm sending it off tomorrow. So that's why it makes sense to workshop it still here with you. And the chapter that I have in this collection is on vegetomorphism. So the human-plant transmutations. And I look at the series Stranger Things and the novel that is part of a trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, Annihilation. And yeah, so I was particularly interested in what type of ecologies are depicted in these narratives. I'm going to start with Stranger Things that probably most of you know and have seen and love or hate. And there, what I think is depicted is an ecological catastrophe that erupts after a government-run company working on a secret mission that involves Earth extraction mistakenly cracks open a portal to a parallel dimension. So this portal is set under the Earth in the subterranean tunnel structure dug by the company known as Hawkins Laboratory, which sets large parts of the series below ground. And I look into the elements that are of the series that are set below the ground and look at how they depict the ecologies there. So the fantastic underground ecology that consequently begins to leak into the quotidian life is referred to as the upside down. And this is what really caught my interest, the upside down, because I work on entanglements between the human and the non-human. I was interested in how this idea of the upside being underground and the underground being up is turned around and is depicted in the series. It is presented as a rhizosphere, a dark world of vines, roots, and tendrils stretching along tunnels under the seemingly peaceful town. So there is a lot happening, and it looks it is a contrast to everything that is happening above the ground, which is a peaceful town, middle class, a Midwestern, suggesting an inversion. A narrative tension emerges between these two antagonistic spaces lying above and below. And unlike classic fantasy settings, the upside down is not an entrance into another dimension that can be exited. Instead, it is a parallel reality that certain characters are drawn into. And this is my main point. It is inside of their bodies. This is why this is where the title comes from. So turning their own environments into the upside down, the body becomes the environment. Yeah. So the dark subterranean world of flora and fauna and stranger things is under the control of a sentient, monstrous, root-like structure. And I should say, this is part of a larger project that I eventually want to work on. So this is the first article that I'm publishing in this direction, and then I'm going to apply for funding, which is on indigenous roots of representations of monsters in popular culture. I see in Stranger Things, so I just wanted to give you, there's lots and lots and lots to say about this, but I just want to give you a few examples, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Share screen. Okay, go back. Okay, can you see the screen? All right. So this dark subterranean world of flora and fauna is under the control of a sentient monstrous root-like structure. This is the shadow monster that I read as a root. It looks like a root. In the series, a doctor interprets this as a virus that is infecting everything that is alive, including the humans, spreading from this root-like structure. The giant, okay, so I'm now here at the Demogorgon, but let me just, this is the shadow monster, and you see how it looks like a root-like structure. It also looks like an inversion of the tree of life. This is a concept found in numerous religions and mythologies. This inverted tree of life, however, does not present a symbol of knowledge as it does in the Christian tradition. Instead, it comes closer to various indigenous versions of the concept in which the image stands for an entity that connects all life. And this is what happens in the series, that all living life is connected. Thus, what they call virus can infect plants. There are scenes of rotten pumpkin fields, or sheep begin to die, and humans begin to rot underground as well. So in this version, the tree is evil. And in my research, I looked at conceptions of the tree of life throughout various cultures, and found out that the indigenous idea of the tree of life goes as far back as 1536 to the Iroquois culture. And as in many other depictions, the Iroquois version mimics a neural and arborescent network that unifies all members of its community. And this type of network has a central place in other native cosmologies as well, such as in the Ojibwe tradition, for example, where it is known as the Midavatic, and it represents the world of plant beings. Images of sentient plant networks have thus been present in North American cultures at least since the 16th century, and most likely much longer. So the root-like structure referred to as the shadow monster in Stranger Things is, of course, not a direct reference to this tradition, but its function as the brain of the nervous system and that it controls all life from underground is at least reminiscent of various indigenous concepts. And as life above the ground appears to have severed itself from its root structure, it is left to innocent and perhaps rooted children to decode the happenings in their town and convince the adults to take earthly matters seriously. So like the classic tree of life, the root-like monster connects all plants, animals, fungi, microbes, through which it gains control over the inhabitants who deem themselves separate from this ecology. And in this way, this neural network exposes the intrinsic inscription of humans into animal and vegetal habitats and into the earth itself. So this is the eco-criticism that I read in this series. I don't know how much time I have. I mean, the connection between plant, animal, and human is very prominent in this series. It is even embodied in the most striking creatures, the demogorgons. And I had a picture here before. So with the head, these are monsters that populate the subterraneous tunnels and have the appearance of a cross, as you can see, between human, animal, and plant. And with a head that looks like a bud when closed and like a flower with 6 petals when open, this creature devours humans. Yet the fragile border between it and human is demonstrated in a scene in which a young demogorgon befriends a child and is placated with a candy bar. And this again, if you remember this scene, is again a moment where the monstrous becomes the human and the human becomes the monstrous. And this separation between the two ecologies, so the upside is down and the down is upside, or the human is inscribed into these ecologies again. Okay, I have, well, basically, relying on Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's convincingly argued theory that a monster is an embodiment of a certain cultural moment, and that, I quote, the monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy. Plus the monster always escapes, as Cohen says, only to return in another time, place, or sequel. I see this happening in Stranger Things. Hints are placed along the way that no solution will be final. So the question arises, what are the fears and desires that this monster is actually addressing? And at the end, after watching this series, we watch the children kind of resolve the problem of this haunted town using their role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons and the logics that they borrow from there. Because what doesn't make sense otherwise becomes obvious through the prism of a fantasy game and opens the questions as to other interrelational models that require active management. As fantasy detectives, the child protagonists resolve the enigma, yet what their gaming strategy reveals is a much more complicated structure that is beyond their understanding. And in the end, the viewers and we are left with questions such as, what is the toxic material that was released in the power plant? What is the secret mission hidden from the inhabitants of the small town? How does it relate to the rotting underground ecology? So this again is the eco-criticism that I find in the series. How much time do I have? Sorry, Dina. Okay, she's not there.
Sorry, 3 more minutes or so.
Oh, okay. So I'm not going to tell you anything about the Demogorgon. But here you have at least a depiction out of Native American traditions of a Wendigo, and you can at least see that there are some correlations, and then I think about these correlations and what they might be. And then I move on to Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. These are images. This is the Spanish edition, which I think is excellent. That's why I have it here on this slide and so much more to the point. And I think it's very interesting to think through Stranger Things and then go to Annihilation, because you know, in a classic eco-horror style, in Stranger Things instrumentalize these tentacular monsters that sedate plants, animals, humans, and take over their habitat. But then in Annihilation, this is a narrative that works with a very similar premise, but it begins where typically plant horror ends. So it finally challenges the evil interpretation that you get in Stranger Things of the human-plant entanglement in very interesting ways by questioning the objectivity of science and this outside position of the scientist looking at nature. Okay, so I'm going to end here, and then maybe we can just leave the rest to the discussion. Like I said, I think it's, there's a lot of material here, and I'm very happy to answer questions. And if you would like to read the book, I think it's going to be really interesting too. There are many more interesting chapters on the entanglements of the human and unhuman in the context of eco-Gothic and eco-horror. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Sladja. So now we are going to move on to our next presenter, Alberto Andres, who is currently an independent researcher based in Manchester, UK. He has most recently completed his MA in Modern and Contemporary Literature at the University of Manchester and is currently working on his PhD proposal. His academic interests include stream of consciousness in modernist and contemporary fiction, the poetics of everyday life, popular music studies, and horror film. And his presentation is titled Ghost of Britain, a Ontological Approach to Contemporary American Folk Horror. So, Alberto, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Just give me 1 second so I can share it. Is that all right? Can you all see that? All right, good. Right, so, well, thank you for having me. We've been talking about monsters so far, but I'm going to change it a bit and talk about ghosts. Not actual ghosts, but cultural ghosts or spectres, if you will. My presentation is on the folk horror revival and ontology. I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to the folk horror film. So its origins can be traced back to Britain in the late 60s and early 70s, with the so-called Unholy Trinity, which is comprised by Witchfinder General, the Blonde Satan's Claw, and the Wicker Man, which is perhaps the most popular one. However, its common usage, particularly in academia and popular cultural publications, does not really happen until the late 2010s. Now, this coincides with its revival. I've selected a few titles, both from UK and Ireland and from the USA, that signal this revival, from A Field in England to The Witch and Midsummer. And I think it's worth investigating this revival through the lens of a culture that is obsessed with its own past. So, writing in 2010 about the music trends of an artist, Simon Reynolds argues that the first decade of the new millennium has been about every other previous decade happening all at once. 10 years after the publication of his book, Retromania, I think this words still ring painfully true. It's true that he writes mostly about popular music, but films not exempt from this Bible-looking craze. As you can see there, if you have a look at the top 50 highest grossing films of the previous decade, most of them are sequels, remakes, or spin-offs. Horror is obviously quite a big part of this as well. I've selected a few examples of this. And I would argue that even goes beyond remake and revival culture. You look at something like Stranger Things, which is purely a nostalgia, it's purely a nostalgia TV show, isn't it? Now there's a transatlantic counterpart to folk horror with titles like The Witch or Midsummer. And I think at this point it best asking several questions. First of all, how does this new American folk horror compare to its British counterpart? And secondly, are these films just grain in time that sort of nostalgia, or do they actually do something new and fresh? So in order to answer these questions, I'm going to use the concept of ontology, but before that, I'm going to delve into the specifics of folk horror. In his book on folk horror, Adam Scoble is quite reluctant to offer a singular definition of it, and I think for very good reasons. I think it might be argued that the delayed emergence of folk horror as a critical category is not only due to the cult status of most of these films, but also due to the lack of a unified shell list of features. So if you study the Ontology community as a whole, what's really striking is that these three films don't really have that much in common. So for example, there's The Wicker Man. It takes a few cues from thrillers and from musicals. There's some really good choreographers in there, Mamma Mia style. If you look at Witchfinder General, it's clearly influenced, I think you can see in the top two screenshots, by the American Western. And you have a look at the Blood on Satan's Claw. It resorts more to jump scares, blood, nudity, sometimes bizarrely, as you can see in the top two screenshots. Satan's Claw is not only metaphorical, but also very much literal. But in any case, I think one of the definitions that Skogel offers in his work is quite good, quite apt, which is that folk horror is a work that uses folklore, either aesthetically or thematically, to imbue itself with a sense of the arcane for eerie, uncanny, or horrific purposes. Going a bit further, I've identified a series of recurring tropes. For example, these films usually take place in the outside, mostly in broad daylight. They engage with the occult rather than the supernatural. They are marred by landscapes, both physical and temporal. There's a clear intermingling with other genres of the scene. Perhaps most importantly as well, these characters transpose to an unfamiliar setting, at odds with their culture, places where, according to Skogel, progress has stopped. Now, the notion of progress stopping, particularly when we're talking about places and settings outside mainstream Western civilization, I think is not without its issues. So I would rather offer the definition that progress is taking an unexpected turn to a return of the occult. But in any case, this notion of progress either stopping or taking an alternative course brings us to ontology. Now, ontology is a pun on Hont plus ontology. It comes from Jacques Derrida's essay Spectres of Marx, where he talks about how the spectres of communism were haunting world politics in the late 20th century. This is a time when neoconservative commentators argue that progress has stopped, history has stopped, we've reached a point which is liberal democracy, where it's the end goal that we all wanted to reach, and now any change that will happen will be minor improvements over the system that we currently live in. So the word ontology was adopted as a general descriptor for music in the noughties by critics like Mark Fisher, Simon Reynolds. And they used it to talk about usually British electronic acts that centralize the materiality of recording technology. For example, vinyl crackle, deteriorating effects, or noise transformed through digital techniques. What is important is that all these noises are transformed into more eerie sonic markers. They're there, but they're not quite there, but they're also there. They act without really physically existing. So ontological art foregrounds the interplay between technology and the past, exploring themes of longing and decay through sheer materiality. As Fisher and others point out, the main difference between ontology and nostalgia is that the former is not only about remembering, but also about amnesia and other memory disorders. If you will, like an alternative way of remembering, represented to certain form of features. So if nostalgia is straight, sometimes uncritical introduction of past tropes, which are not thought to be out of style, ontology plays around with these tropes a bit more, which grants them a Gothic character. And I'm going to play a short clip of ontological music. This is William Basinski's Disintegration tapes, and I'm just going to play a really short clip, so I think it's worth hearing. So what we have here is the loop repeated over and over again, and the loop is deteriorated with time. So what you hear at first is completely different from what you're going to hear 15 minutes in, even though it, on paper, is the same piece of music. So as the first loop, and let's see if I can, yeah. And that we hear at the end. Can you all hear that? Did you play right? No. Right. Well, never mind. I can post something afterwards. But the idea is that sound is deteriorated through digital means. Now, the link between horror film and ontology is, thankfully for me, not one that needs to be artificially drawn up. I think film, particularly folk horror, has always been central to ontological music. I've written up a few examples: Nigel Neal, The Caretaker. But I want to emphasize that this is very much an ongoing open dialogue, where now you've got films like A Film in England, like The Endless, that use ontological tropes that were first heard in music. I think another key aspect that is worth bringing in is that both are mostly regarded as British disciplines. With the case of ontology, it happens mostly because most ontology scholars are British, so they tend to be more familiar with British culture. However, as we've seen the past few years, we've seen an increase in the number and popularity of American folk horror films. So I think it's worth asking, are these new American folk horror films ripe for ontological analysis as the British counterparts? In order to do this, we'll continue to stick to music. We'll begin with The Witch by Robert Eggas, where the director's brief to the composer Mark Corbin was to write a minimalistic and melodic score with no electronics. As a result, the film's soundtrack is a terrifying collection of traditional hymns that ground the Witch family as a period film, plus a series of folk ambient pieces. The key word here is folk. Corbin's score bears a number of similarities with electronic ambient music, most notably the omnipresence of drums, but it achieves this through the use of obscure traditional instruments like the nickel harper instead of through any digital sources. Now, this generates an overlapping of timelines that destabilizes the film's status as a period film. Due to the use of lead-filled drone instruments, the score is ultimately more reminiscent of the dark ambient records of Brandyn or Rupert than actual folk music. Another quite interesting fact is that Mark Corbin ended up commissioning a new instrument because of his work on The Witch. Nicknamed the Apprehension Engine, is supposed to mimic the eerie and ghostly effect that you can get with electronic music. So I think this is a really good example of ontology being an open conversation between past and present, and analog and digital. There's the creation of an analog instrument that's chasing the spectrality and the eeriness of the digital. That's the Apprehension Engine in all its glory. It's not pocket size, obviously. Now we're going to move to England again with Ben Whitley's A Film in England, released in 2013, which presents a completely opposite approach to The Witch. Whereas The Witch, I think, it's a similar case of recycling aesthetic choices and plot points from past folk horror films, though where the formal interplay between past and present grant these films a certain freshness and uniqueness. So in A Film in England, we've got prominent electronics. However, the main theme of the film is Balloon Boy. This is an early modern folk song, Scottish, that first appears theatrically, sung by one of the characters. Now, there's nothing particularly interesting about this at first, but as the narrative goes on, and the characters succumb to the effects of some mushrooms, this curtain's more synth-based, electronic, and experimental. So by the film's ending, Balloon Boy appears not sung by a character, but as a heavily distorted version of itself. Now, this song's degradation through digital means is exactly what I try to show with Basinski's piece. It's a tear a hole into the film's historical fabric, opening up what Mark Fisher calls a time wound, a chronological fracture. I think it's easy to see how this might be regarded as a ontological trope. This synchronicity and anachronisms are brought about by formal devices. Now, these devices are not only limited to music, there's also a visual side of it. I don't have the time to go into it, but there's a really good essay in Joel McKim on how A Film in England mirrors 1960s television. And now finally, we're moving back to the US, moving to Ari Aster's Midsummer, Then just take to music for a bit and talk about the score, which is composed by the electronic artist The Higgs and Cloak. The score presents a new distinction between folk-oriented orchestral tunes like Fire Temple, Maple, and more asphyxiating other page string pieces that, recycling a well-trodden horror trope, are reserved for the most shocking and horrifying scenes. So we've got a clear-cut distinction between diegetic and non-diegetic as well, as opposed to the blurring that takes place in a film in England. Now, I would argue that the film's use of other page strings in moments of high terror is one of the many ways in which the film engages with a kind of horror film that critics have actually tried to separate it from. I think like Astor's debut, Hereditary, Midsommar wears its care in its sleeve. The film starts with a very shocking image, suicide and murder, plus the emotional breakdown following up to that. But I think what's interesting is that initially non-specialized popular publications and gradually in academia as well, particularly the work of David Church, I think much has been written about Astor's favoring of mood and slow burning narratives, so very quick, cheap shocks. But I think this is actually a bizarrely arbitrary way to praise the work of a director whose films include the visual beheading of children, followed up by numerous flashbacks of the rotten, severe heads, a man being burnt alive, close-up shots of broken limbs, crushed skulls, which are then repeatedly recrushed by Dana Hammer, among others. But in this sense, actually, Astor's work recuperates that folk horror tradition of intermingling with later genres. I think it arguably finds a middle ground between folk horror and more exploitative torture porn films like Host or Saw. However, the difference is that in Astor's case, the torture is not only physical but also emotional. And if you think of when Danny's parents and sister die, it was really shocking about those scenes, not the death itself, but that you've got like a 2 or 3 minute scene of with loads of close-ups of Danny crying. So in order to sort of a brief conclusion, because I'm running out of time, I would argue like The Witch or A Film in England, the spectre of familiarity haunts Midsommar. However, unlike the 2 previously mentioned films, Midsommar only engages with these ghosts through the recycling of plot points and the aping of past representations of the past. I've selected a few screenshots that I think showcase this quite clearly. That's from the one from the right is from the Blood on Satan's Clock, the left Midsommar. The ones on the bottom, from the Wicker Man and Midsommar, the final Sacrifice Through Fire. So my final point is that Midsommar can ultimately be seen as folk horror pastiche. It does not engage with its past ghosts through aesthetic and formal conversation, but it's simply satisfied with wearing their mask.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alberto, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And now we're going to move to our last presenter of the panel today, Brandyn Whitaker, whose presentation is titled, "We Will Conquer This Wilderness, It Will Not Consume Us, The Destruction of Place in the Cabin Horror Genre." So Brandyn Whitaker recently completed graduate work at Middle Tennessee State University. Having always been enamored with American literature and film's use of the North American wilderness, eco-criticism and the ever-growing fields of eco-horror and eco-Gothic studies have dominated his research interests. So Brandyn, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. And so my presentation today is taken from taken from a section of my one of the chapters of my master's thesis. So it's heavily condensed for the 15-minute presentation time. But if you have any questions, I'd definitely love to talk more about it. But since I've got a lot to cover, I'll go ahead and dive right in. An essential component within the cabin horror narrative is the eventual disillusionment of the cabin's safety. Whether torn asunder, secretly infiltrated, or forcibly abandoned, all films within the subgenre end with the cabin no longer being held as the refuge of safety it at first seemed to be. To better understand the importance of the fall of the cabin and the origination of the ecophobia surrounding this fall, it's helpful to draw from human geography's terms of space and place. Space and place are two human constructs that are intertwined with one another. Elizabeth Parker in The Forest and the ECOGOTHIC contends that, quote, space can be interpreted in different ways. It can be seen as absolute, that is, as literal, physical space that can be precisely and cartographically recorded, or as relative, meaning that it is interpreted perceptually, and as such refuses to be objectively quantifiable. It is thus divided respectively into place and space, end quote. You cannot have place without it existing within a space. By endowing space with a value through acquaintance, it transforms into place. From the acquaintance of place, it becomes familiar and gains associations of security and stability, which in turn creates an awareness of the openness, freedom, and threat of space. Quote, to be open and free is to be exposed and vulnerable, end quote, writes Swan in a similar work, Space and Place, the Perspective of Experience. Expanding upon the relationship between space and place, Tuan adds, enclosed and humanized space is place. The cabin, therefore, is a perfect example of place, with its enclosing walls serving as a strong boundary identifying place from space. Parker likewise notices the connection between space, place, and eco-Gothic studies. Quote, we quickly recognize the forest as unhomely, as space rather than place, and as somewhere to get lost rather than somewhere to feel at home, end quote. It is natural to connect the forest, a wild space in part defined by the lack of humans, as space rather than place, just as the cabin can be easily viewed as place, providing a sense of safety and security to a film's protagonist. With this dynamic between the forest and the cabin in mind, Parker concludes that, quote, divisions between place and space are permanently threatened. The human-made structures that do exist in the expanses of the forest are overwhelmed and infected by the outside. They lose their security as they rot, disintegrate, or literally blow away, and are revealed as merely a part of the territory of the monster, end quote. I fully support Parker's assertion that the division between place and space is a core conflict within eco-Gothic films. Parker's description of the failing human-made structure would fit perfectly as a description for the Evil Dead franchise's cabins, as well as the destroyed cabins of Cabin Fever and The Witch. By observing the cabin and its surrounding forest as locations of place and space, it allows for a new lens to analyze the conflict between these two locations. Specifically, the goal of this presentation is to analyze how cabin horror films each construct the invasions of their cabins, how the construction is meant to drive horror in the viewers, and what these invasions tell us about our relationship to the natural world. As the safety of the cabin is breached, it highlights the insecurities of man-made structures against the forces of nature and of outside threat. Tuan, writing about fears derived from open circles, maintains, quote, we draw boundaries and protect their apertures. Nonetheless, security is not absolute. Horror is the sudden awareness of betrayal and death in the inner sanctum of our refuge, end quote. The betrayal of the inner sanctum, in this case the cabin, is the core foundational dread on which the cabin horror subgenre is built upon. However, it is not the only driving factor for how these films function. There is, once more, a loss of agency at the hands of the outside agents who overtake the cabin. Due to the infiltrators' connection to the forest outside of the cabin, this invasion of space and overtaking of place is therefore also driven by and creating ecophobic anxieties. And here's an image from the homestead in The Witch. And you can see this distinct line between the forest and then what is could be deemed as place, as kind of separated from this, these wilderness spaces. A core component of the cabin horror genre is the shown movement of characters heading from civilization to the wilderness and towards the cabin destination. On the left here, you can see images from, on the top is Antichrist, and on the bottom is from the Evil Dead remake. Most commonly, this occurs within the film either during the opening with wide shots of the forest as the camera follows our protagonist's road trip towards the cabin, or shortly after establishing our characters and their reason for journeying into the forest, which can be seen in Cabin in the Woods. This journey clearly outlines the status of the wilderness as space as opposed to the cabin as place. The protagonists within the cabin horror films are often thrilled when they arrive at the cabin, a feeling sometimes elevated at the thought of the partying that the wilderness's freedom will enable. For both the cabin in the woods and cabin fever, the rustic appearance of the cabin becomes a part of its initial charm. Even if the characters are not shown initially elated, there's always a moment of reprieve and enjoyment linked to the cabin setting, such as the dinner scene in The Evil Dead, which is shown here on the right. Ash playing the piano while Linda dances in Evil Dead 2, or the game of Truth or Dare in The Cabin in the Woods. It's through these scenes that the characters become comfortable within the cabin, which alongside its naturally sheltering qualities, transcends the location from space to place. Just as the characters need to feel some amount of comfort from the cabin, at least so much in that it is less threatening than the forest, it must also be portrayed as a plausible place of protection. The idea of the cabin as a protective location is in part inherent of any walled structure. Fawn notes, quote, "The wall of the house or of a town provided both physical protection and magical defense against human enemies, demons, violent weather, and disease," end quote. While we no longer need the walls of a town or house as a magical barrier, the physical uses remain virtually the same. Furthermore, when the protagonists of the cabin horror genre are faced with unexplainable threats, there's a return to the reliance and hope that the cabin's walls will protect them from the supernatural threats. Even as outside forces begin to infiltrate or destroy the cabin, characters will still continue to put faith in the idea of place as safety over the alternative space of the wilderness. In Evil Dead 2, Ash flees into the house. However, the evil is able to burst down the door and freely move through the abode, as you can see here on the left. The cabin in the Evil Dead franchise is largely inconsistent in its safety, and yet characters, especially Ash, unfailingly return to its confines. It is the illusion of safety that repeatedly draws the characters back. The idea that the walls might offer some protection, or that through adding barricades on the windows they'll be protected. The only alternative to the cabin would be to brave the far wilderness surrounding it. Ash claims in regard to the evil, quote, "It lives out there in those woods, out there in the dark," end quote. With the forest hiding the evil, there's nowhere else but the cabin to turn to for safety. The bridge on the main road gets destroyed in both films. In Evil Dead 2, the trail that Jake, a local, used to get the other supporting characters to the cabin completely disappears. The cabin is the only alternative, and although it does continue to fail, it doesn't stop the characters within the film, nor the audience watching, from placing faith in its ability to defend. The isolation and the invasion or overtaking of the cabin creates the true horror within the subgenre, the collapse of the last vestige of safety and the symbolic destruction of human attempts to exert control over the natural world. After the character's faith in the cabin is established, the films within the cabin horror subgenre are free to begin the relentless onslaught upon its protagonists and their place of refuge. While our heroes may hold off the wilderness forces for a time, ultimately the cabin must fall, leaving the characters to either die in the wilderness or, on the rare happy ending, to manage a return to civilization. It is to the fall of the cabin, its return from place back into the wilderness space, that we turn to next. For the films The Evil Dead and The Evil Dead 2, the breach of the cabin is shown through the physical destruction of the cabin, accompanied by a change in shot composition. As the film continues and the cabin becomes less and less secure, Sam Raimi shoots more scenes inside the cabin using Dutch angles. The use of the Dutch angles creates a sense of unease since it rotates the camera so that the natural horizon is on a tilt. Raimi uses it within the film to convey Ash's further descent into madness, but it also expresses the cabin's ever-increasing instability. Even more than the first film, Evil Dead 2 makes use of this technique, as the cabin itself becomes possessed by the evil. Shooting a scene in which all the furniture in the house begins to move and mock Ash, Raimi moves from one Dutch angle to another, focusing on dancing table lamps and books flapping on their own, all laughing and taunting. As the camera pans out, the shot reveals Ash standing in the middle of this madness, still via a Dutch angle. At this point, the cabin has ceased to be a protective or defensive structure. It has thus lost its identity as place. It is in the complete control of the evil. You can see that here on the right. The change in the cabin from place to space in both The Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 is likewise illustrated through the evil's freedom of movement within the structure. This becomes even more apparent when the cabin is finally destroyed. Set on fire in Evil Dead, and the walls torn asunder by a large demonic tree creature in Evil Dead 2. The destruction of the cabin's spatial boundaries results in the unquestionable abandonment of the cabin as a place of safety. Since the cabin's space is an embodiment of humanity's ability to survive in and have agency over the natural world, the deconstruction of the cabin space indicates that this believed agency is merely an illusion. The initial attack or rebellion is not necessarily the scariest aspect of these horror films. Instead, is the loss of place and the safety and agency that it granted. The witch tells a similar tale of disillusionment at the hands of the wilderness. William, the head of the family, states early on that he will not be consumed by the wilderness, and instead he will conquer it. He is driven to prove that not only can he and his family survive in the wilderness, but also prosper. By the end of the film, William's family will be torn apart, one of his children missing, and the barn of his homestead completely decimated, along with the livestock housed there. And you can see this in the bottom left picture. The physical destruction of the barn is similar to that of the cabin in the Evil Dead franchise. By showing the murder of the domesticated animals, the film illustrates the primacy of the wild over both humans and creatures they dominate. The death of the domesticated animals further cements the theme that the wilderness is reclaiming the land that William and his family settled on and falsely thought they could turn into place. It is also of note to discuss the additional form of invasion present within the witch, that of psychological contamination through Caleb, Thomason's brother, as carrier. When a naked Caleb returns from being lost in the forest, unable to speak and conflicted with an unknown element, the family tries to care for him and pray for his health. It is during this moment of prayer that the twins, Mercy and Jonas, are unable to speak the Lord's Prayer, and Caleb's body shakes and spasms as though in reaction to the prayer. The Caleb who returns has been changed after giving in to sinful temptation within the forest. After his fall from grace, Caleb becomes a contaminated body meant to sow discord within his family back at their homestead. Soon after the prayer, Caleb dies, and Thomason is accused of witchcraft. William, uncertain what to believe anymore, locks up both the twins and Thomason in the barn, removing them from the cabin's safety while also attempting to remove further supernatural contamination of the home. This move mirrors the decision made by the cabin fever protagonist to exile Karen after she has become diseased. However, by this point, both the family and the homestead have already been too far disoriented by the wilderness, and the destruction of place within the wilderness is inevitable. Eli Roth's film, Cabin Fever, does not contain the usual physical destruction and invasion of the cabin, but instead it commits entirely to an unseen contamination, ultimately achieving the same effect. The invasion found within Cabin Fever more closely matches the contamination brought on by Caleb's return, where unseen factors lead to the destruction of the cabin as place. Most notably, Roth's film utilizes two separate methods of unseen natural invasion to deconstruct the cabin as a place of safety. The first is in the human body as a natural carrier. Even though Karen, the first case among our Cabin Fever protagonists, is quickly isolated, the bedsheets she was sleeping on and the bathroom she used has blood spilled everywhere, a clear sign of the contamination already making its way into the cabin. The second unseen invasion, and the most frightening, is water entering the cabin. Not a single character within the film explicitly mentions the water's contamination. Instead, Roth uses a tracking shot to reveal the dead body of an infected man floating in the reservoir, and then follows a series of pipes up to the cabin before settling on a glass of water being filled. The sequence uses continuity editing that ties each image together, allowing the audience to feel as though they are watching the contaminated water actually flow from the reservoir into the cup of water. Characters in the cabin never considered the possibility that the water coming into the cabin might be contaminated, since they view the cabin as of refuge, as place. The collapse of the cabin as place in the film Cabin Fever is not through its rampant physical destruction, but rather its inability to keep its inhabitants safe from the virus. Although perceived to be a location separate from the outside world, this was never true to begin with. The free, uninhibited movement of the water from the outdoor reservoir into the cabin contradicts the perceptions of the cabin as an impenetrable fortress against the surrounding wilderness agency. Cabin horror films have endured because the battle between humanity and the natural world is not only still ongoing, but also remains a fear that permeates modern society. The modern film audience may no longer have to worry about a panther with burning eyes peering through the window, but it is confronted with a constant stream of natural disaster footage and global warming reports. Natural disaster and the potential ramifications of the global climate crisis carry with them the idea that the natural world, space, is beyond humanity's control and threatens the cities and homes we find comfort in place. Cabin horror, through the use of the cabin setting and its place within the broader American cultural mythos, removes its characters and thus the audience from civilization and places them in an expansive and archaic nature. Since the cabin represents humanity's ability to exert control over a section of the forest, its fall due to the threatening wilderness becomes a visualization of humanity's larger inability to truly maintain any sort of agency over the natural world. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. That's the end.
Thank you very much, Brandyn. It was very, very interesting indeed. And Now we have time for the Q&A session. So if anybody in the audience would like to ask our presenters some questions. So Anna, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I'm sure more will come. I will just break the ice. I have, first of all, a question for Sladja. I don't know if it was because you were just introducing your topic, so I would like to know a little bit more about the indigenous connections that you were drawing. Can you delve a little bit more into that? What kind of indigenous communities you think the connections can be drawn? Is there some specific topics, some specific ethnic related themes to it? I don't know. I just was wondering about it. Thank you.
Okay. It's so both Chef Vandermeer and the Duffer brothers claim to have been influenced strongly by Lovecraft. And one of the points that I make is that Lovecraft himself, as one of the very few US American popular writers who insistently pushed forward the agency of the non-human, might have been borrowing a lot more from native cosmologies in his country than he was willing to admit. There are some first studies are coming out right now about Lovecraft borrowing from Aztec mythology, for example. Then James Goho just published an article where he documents numerous references to indigenous North American people in Lovecraft's writing, etc. So there is via Lovecraft a lot of indigenous narrative storytelling already, because they're referencing Lovecraft so much already in here. So this is one thing. I mean, of course, I have a very, very long list of very specific material that I think is not referenced directly, but is part of general part of North American culture and is not acknowledged as such. For example, in his study of the Koyukon point of view on the boreal forest in what is today the United States of Alaska, the anthropologist Richard Nelson describes the forest as a vibrant environment that watches. And then there are long depictions of walking in the woods, moving through a forest of eyes, how walking in the woods to the Koyukon communities is like moving through a forest of eyes. There's almost one-to-one depictions like this you can find in Annihilation. So I'm looking for these correspondences, and I'm not saying that these writers have stolen everything from native traditions and have not acknowledged those. I'm just saying that they are a part of North American culture that needs to be much more acknowledged. And by doing so, by looking at telling correspondences between Native American cosmologies and monsters in Native American cosmologies and spirits in popular culture, we're kind of also going away from ugly stereotypes such as the ecological Indian or whatever. So it's kind of also a way of decolonizing eco-horror, I think.
Okay, thank you. I found both Alberto and Brandyn's presentations very interesting, and yet it's not much my field. But I was thinking, I found interesting how Alberto was drawing on music. So I was thinking maybe in the text that Brandyn was talking about, is there some connection to that as well? You think? Can you in some way draw a connection between the two presentations? I don't know, I just felt that they could somehow, some parts of them could somehow converse.
Is that for Brandon or for me?
For both. I mean, if you feel that there is some kind of possible conversation between your two analyses.
Well, we've both talked about the witch and this idea of movements of us wilderness and of taking characters and putting them in that unfamiliar setting. Not quite sure that how the music bit relates to it. But, yeah, I suppose it does. Because I suppose it might even signal this sort of lack of control over the natural world that Brandon was talking about via the introduction of more say, electronic elements that are obviously out of that folk tradition. So I suppose you could kind of connect it with that. But other than that, I can't really think of anything else, unfortunately.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about the music at another section in my thesis of particularly The Witch, but I did think it was interesting you brought up the instruments and things, because one of the aspects of the Witch's soundtrack that I both really like and discussed at a different section is that it's, I'm probably gonna mess up the term, but I think it's dissident. It's where there's no lull in the music. It's always kind of on edge, and that Eggers kind of particularly went to Corvin and wanted it that way, where there's and if you listen to the soundtrack, you'll definitely kind of know that there's never a moment of kind of relief almost the entire time between the apprehension engine and the nickel harpa and everything kind of combined together. You're whenever the actual score is playing, you're always kind of on the edge of your seat wondering what's going to happen. And I discussed how it's related to images of the forest, that it's usually overlaid with the forest as a backdrop. So like the first time you hear the soundtrack really kick in is as they leave, and that first night they spend in the forest kind of where you see these shadows all around them. Or it kind of reaches a peak when the family sees their homestead and they start to say kind of a prayer over the land that will become where they're going to build their cabin and their home. But as the music kind of reaches its loudest point, the camera is kind of panned up to focus just on the forest itself. So it kind of ties this dissonant sound, the sound that never lets you kind of relax, to the forest and like the dangers that could be within it.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, the fact that there's no melody at all in any of the pieces. Like as you said, it's very discordant, isn't it? It doesn't, it's not whether they're minor or major key. There's just literally no melody. It's just pure dread, which I think really exacerbates what you presented, really.
It's definitely something I want to go back to now and look at with pieces like Midsummer, and I haven't seen A Field in England yet, but I know it's on my list to watch. But how they, if they're intermingling kind of these two more folk pieces with kind of more produced maybe electronic things, how they're being, integrated like and moving from one or the other, I think could definitely be interesting with the wilderness spaces. So I'll definitely have to check that out.
Thank you.
Okay, so Paul, I think you raised your hand before.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I put it down just because I saw that Sladja had a hand up, so I didn't know if she wanted to come back and maybe add something. So Sladja, did you have something to comment about the previous question? Oh, okay. Do you mind if I go ahead then, Sladja? Okay. It's a question actually. I think it's relevant to both Alberto and Brandyn, because you both kind of reference kind of canonical movies from the past in the folk horror genre and in the cabin genre. And I was particularly kind of interested in what you said, Brandyn, about how nature is kind of always represented as a threat. And I was just wondering, really, if you think, and if Alberto, maybe you also have something to say about whether you think actually kind of nowadays that notion that nature is a threat, we've kind of moved beyond that, that there is a kind of more ecological consciousness happening in these type of genres, where actually kind of, you know, we've gone beyond that nature is a threat, and it's very much about we're the threat to nature rather than the other way round, you know. And if actually kind of these genres are doing something which is much more interesting now than perhaps has been done for many years in the past.
Well, I'll argue that that's always been the case. If you look at the Wicker Man, it's not so much nature itself, but the folk that inhabit that nature, isn't it? That causes the terror. But in terms of folk horror, there's, for example, the blood from Satan's Claw, I think is a good example of nature being horrific. In that film, there's Kate literally dug up from the fields, from the pharaohs. So I'm not quite sure if it's an idea that is being sort of contested or that it's always been there. Now maybe it's been more like brought to the fore. But it is true that, for example, if you look at Midsummer, again, like the Wicker Man is not so much the actual nature, is it? It's just the folk that inhabit that nature. Yeah. Whereas other than The Witch, I think The Witch, because it recycles more tropes that, you know, like the woods and stuff like that, which I think they're really hard to disassociate in our mind from horror. So I'm not quite sure how The Witch should fit into that, but I've definitely seen it some of this. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, Brandon, because what interests me about the kind of cabin genre is the fact that, you know, when you get some of the images you're shown, and you see how the cabin is kind of very much integrated into the environment, you know, and because it's made of wood, and, you know, it's part of its location, you know, and you do get that sense really about it's not the cabin but the people, you know. And I was just wondering if you think that there is a kind of increasing sense now, particularly in American folk horror, that there is a kind of ecological crisis that does need to be addressed in some way through horror, and through particularly rural horror.
I think it's kind of a mix. So within cabin horror in particular, and kind of in my longer chapter on it, I link it back to this, partially as with almost everything or a lot of things in American lit, you can, especially with the wilderness, it kind of goes back to the puritanical things. But cabin horror specifically, I look at kind of frontier Gothic works and things like Amber Bierce's Boarded Window and kind of short stories like that, and draw parallels between some frontier Gothic works and cabin horror, particularly. And I think that genre in particular, the forest, is always, at least on the kind of a surface level, going to be portrayed as the antagonist, because it's kind of so baked into both Evil Dead and which is kind of the film that kind of started the genre itself and what a lot of them pull from. But I definitely would say that if you look at, like, The Witch, I think is a perfect example of a film that complicates that, where if you look at it on the surface, it's and one of the reasons I love it so much is because it basically is a Puritan folktale through and through. It's exactly what you'd kind of think of if you were to look at, you know, like, why were you know, the Puritans kind of scared of the forest, and it's like this spiritual temptation. And so it reads just like almost like a you know, like a bedtime story to like scare a Puritan kid or something. Like, this is why you don't go out in the woods. But you also have the complications that the Thomasin at the end, it's not necessarily a kind of bad ending for Thomasin. She gains freedom from this patriarchal kind of controlling society on her, and kind of finds this community within the wilderness that, so it's not necessarily just a pure kind of cut and dry, the woods are, you know, bad, there's no kind of positive with the forest. So I think maybe more modern texts are investigating the relationship more interestingly, but due to the kind of conventions of the cabin horror genre, it often comes, at least on some level, of like, you still have this antagonistic relationship, you still have forces tied to the wilderness kind of invading the cabin. And just to comment on what you mentioned with the cabin being kind of structured and built of the woods, I think it's very interesting. For me, I read the cabin largely as a form of agency being attempted to be exerted over these wilderness spaces, because both from kind of the actual, like, these frontier kind of pioneers that went out into the forest who, you know, leveled down trees to make their homestead, you're kind of exerting, you know, using the wilderness to build your home, to like turning this natural space into something, into, you know, place, into your home. You're kind of converting it for your own means. And then in Cabin Horror, you see this kind of reclamation of this land. It's taking it back.
Thanks. Really interesting answers. Thank you. If you don't mind, I've just got just a quick question for Sladja about dark, which I don't think is really related to kind of your stuff in terms of monsters and things like that. But I just wondered if you'd come across or considered dark, because it seems like it's got some potential connections to what you're saying about, you know, the kind of, have you seen dark, Sladja? Your microphone, sorry.
Actually, I still haven't seen it. I started watching it, and it's on my viewing list. And the reason why I still haven't seen it, and the list is very long, is because the focus on nuclear power. And I thought this would really take it in a different direction, right. Which it does. So yeah, it's but yeah, I unfortunately cannot answer the question right now.
No, sorry, yeah, but I see what you mean about that. I wondered about the nuclear power just in terms of the kind of ecological angle, you know, and the fact right. It's created this kind of wormhole that kind of causes all the problem. But it might be worth checking out. I mean, it's pretty hard going. It takes some watching, but yeah, but it might be worth checking out.
That's why I still haven't done it. I started, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you. Thanks for all of your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually had a question for Sladja about you mentioned that the Demogorgon as this root, and I was wondering if you can read it as almost like an invasive plant, as where it kind of, I know it seems to leave its kind of mark everywhere, as it tries to maybe, like, I don't know, take over kind of our world.
The problem with this interpretation is that it is set apart from the human, and I was trying to demonstrate that it's very much entangled with the human protagonists, and I particularly picked the scenes where this is maybe not intentionally worked with, but the Demogorgon also traditionally is a creature that is related to the human, and I'm sure that that the Duffer brothers have done their research. It's not an invasive plant. It's maybe an invasive human plant that is trying to take over the world. So in this way, yes, the whole series, I think, is about this compound of human, plant, animal that has gone, that is evil, trying to take over the space, turn it into an upside down, starting with the bathroom, spreading to the house, the cabin in the woods, and etc. Yeah. But I also had a question. I don't know if it's, am I on the list now? Dina? Yeah. I also
sorry, Brandyn just asked his question before I could.
That's fine.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's actually, I mean, I kind of had the same question that Paul had just asked, but then I was thinking, are you in any way connecting your interpretation to this really long tradition of celebrating the cabin as the place of freedom? That goes back to Walden, and you know, if I think about cabins in the North American context, this is the first cabin that comes to mind. And so is this the opposite? Or, I mean, there is really a long tradition that goes into our own times with Rebecca Solnit and Wanderlust and walking through the woods and you know, discovering yourself, etc. So is this tradition the opposite to the horror cabin, or does it somehow relate to it? Because it seems like maybe this would also answer the question how nature is maybe not only evil.
Yeah, definitely. There's I think you kind of basically summed up perfectly these like kind of two traditions in at least the way I see it in for the American wilderness, where you have, as you mentioned, this kind of more positive, you find yourself in the forest. It's a source of freedom of thought, and like Walden. But there's also this kind of underside to that, and Peter and Carroll writes about Puritanism and the wilderness, and he has an interesting line which basically mentions that the Puritans had this kind of dual fighting perspective on how they viewed this kind of unkept wilderness that they saw as they kind of landed and started to colonize, which in part it was the land that they could turn into a new Eden for themselves, that they could kind of build these communities and prosper within this wilderness space. So that was kind of the positive side, but the negative is also kind of tied to this idea of that there's almost too much freedom in the wilderness, because for Puritans, particularly once you get outside of community, they saw that there was a risk of becoming more savage, becoming more like the Native Americans, which they viewed kind of negatively, or also kind of the spiritual temptation. You remove yourself from the community of where you have kind of those communal pressures on you to stay kind of righteous. But once you get away from that and you're given this freedom, you kind of fall to temptation. You can, like Goodman Brown, you can kind of meet the devil on this journey into the forest. And that's where cabin horror, you see this trend of usually the characters go into the woods because they can party there. They can drink, they can have sex, they can escape these maybe more pure, still kind of leftover puritanical societal pressures of the city. So they can go out into the woods, out to this cabin where they're free to do what they want, to have fun. But there's almost always this negative repercussion. You look at Cabin in the Woods kind of addresses this, where I think it's like right as the characters are kind of starting to party, they're playing Truth or Dare. That's when they have the basement kind of blow open, and then all the events that'll start kind of the supernatural stuff happens right after that. That there's this connection between, you know, going to the woods, the party, and then the punishment for that.
Yeah, and I do think that this directly connects to Walden and his cabin in the woods, because it was supposed to be, you know, the figure of simplicity, and the idea is that you go into the woods to understand that you actually don't need anything, and if you know, these narratives that you are talking about are about excess and about partying, and then the thing happens. Yeah. So yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, if it's really necessary to read them as two separate traditions that kind of merge together.
Yeah, that would probably be possible. I haven't really looked into it too much, focusing more on these kind of darker portrayals of the wilderness. But yeah, I think you could definitely put the two in conversation, where yeah, perhaps it's like the excess is what drives this, but yeah, I'll have to think more about that.
Okay, so thank you for that. Would anybody else like to ask another question? No. Well, I have a kind of a question for Sladja, because I was thinking about Netflix TV series Ragnarok. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's kind of yeah, also touches upon this how climate change and how well, I don't know how to explain it properly. It's not about monsters, but Nordic mythology, and how the gods resurrect in our present. And also this might connect to what you were talking about, how the TV series Stranger Things also appropriates Native American mythology. And in this ECOGOTHIC genre. So, well, but if you haven't watched it, then you can't really reply.
What is it called?
Ragnarok.
Ragnarok. Okay, I'll definitely watch it. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any other questions? No. So maybe we can wrap the this panel up, Anna, or
Yes. I don't know if anyone in the public wants to turn their camera on just to say our last goodbye to our speakers today. I think it was a very good panel. Your presentations were quite interesting. So thank you very much. The debate as well was quite stimulating. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.